Hello, welcome back to our regular history series looking at the history of what we in the West euphemistically call the Silk Roads. Now, we've taken quite a long journey. We started looking at Neolithic China because in order to understand the civilization that emerged in Mesopotamia, we had to understand the civilization that existed there. In order to understand the development of the civilization in Mesopotamia, we had to understand the trade with the Indus Valley, and then we had to understand their progression up the Fertile Crescent, their interaction with other people, to understand the establishment of that political engine at the Levant that you can see in the ruins of modern-day Petra, with the sacred complex, the harem function, and the trading oasis at its core. In order to understand the civilization that emerged in Egypt, you had to understand the geographical context, the fact that gold was a very, very key in abundance, and then that was essential to understanding the emergence of the civilization in Nubia. Between this, we had the establishment of a political centre of governance, and then we had an economic centre. We continued to look at the Bronze Age collapse, and as we did so, we had to look around the Mediterranean. We had to look at the Greek islands, the Minoan civilization, and their connection with the Mountain Gate, the Cilician Gate, in modern-day Turkey. These civilizations are shaped by each other. None exists in isolation, and this is nowhere more true than the modern world. Globalization did not begin in the 20th century. It began when Neolithic man went for a walk looking for something. Now, what we're going to do today, before we kind of look, there's a very distinct kind of change in the development of civilization that's marked out through the kind of dominance of the Persians, who are very important, and the emergence of Greek civilization. But in order to understand that change, you have to understand the foundation that they're built on. We're not talking about systems that pop into being. We're making grand sweeps over time, and we're talking about systems developing from their roots. I quite like the earlier in history you go, the smaller the cast of characters and the kind of easier it is to understand. But that's because you're understanding the roots of systems that then get more and more and more complex. My interest is actually not history. I'm not a historian. My interest is welfare systems, and the converse of studying welfare systems is always studying wars. It's just the relationship, because you're talking about political economy. This is the very roots of political economy for all our civilizations. The reason I kind of look at religious texts is because welfare systems, their roots came with the fact that temples would redistribute food resources. At the temples in the ruins at Hattusha, you find huge food silos. Because the temple would be responsible for redistributing the food resources, it would become a source of power. This would give rise to real-world power structures. And actually, this is the relationship between kingship and welfare that actually is at the centre of modern political economies in democracies today. Now, the Phoenicians are literally, they're not actually the name of this civilization. I talked about the double naming system that shaped where they use the Jordan Valley and they use the side adjacent to the Mediterranean as the front face to protect this other site in the Jordan Valley that's at modern day Petra. The word Phoenician, it comes from Greek sources. Our understanding of this civilization comes from a combination of Greek sources, biblical sources, and the impact of this people through their artifacts and other things on other civilizations. They're famed for their maritime routes. Our geography, I think, in the modern world is pretty terrible considering how interconnected our civilizations are. The Phoenicians had a very, very expansive maritime networks. And while the classical age, Rome and kind of Greece, are defined by thinking the world stops at the end of the Mediterranean, the sea routes that the Phoenicians actually kind of had demonstrate they were anything but that's because they're a civilization with roots in the Near East. Now, the key maritime routes that we kind of want to understand for the next few videos are their routes on the Mediterranean. This civilization, these maritime networks that kind of had their roots in a city called Tyre. We said about these cities that evolved on the coast of the Levant, where modern day Israel is. Tyre is modern day Lebanon, I think. They actually, over time, they came to hold the entire Mediterranean. centres emerge at the southern tip of Spain and kind of at the northern tip of Morocco. What we call the Straits of Gibraltar were actually described in the ancient world as the Pillars of Hercules. This was the entrance point to the Mediterranean world itself. They held this entire kind of world. Their power base was along the North African coast. So you have the cities like Tyre and Sidon on the Levant, and you have kind of the southern tip of Spain and what we would call Morocco kind of holding it at the Straits of Gibraltar. But you also have kind of holding points kind of emerging around what we would call modern day Tunis. In actual fact, you can see the ruins of the city of Carthage. It's not very far from Tunis. I feel actually awful because I was in Tunis on holiday about 10 years ago and I didn't know anything about this, and I could have gone to see this place. It's actually breathtaking. The harbour was a work of engineering magnificence, like really. The centre of Cyrene, which is modern day Libya, was key to holding and managing these networks, as well as this economic centre, which is at the Nubia. And if you look at where Axum is, it's kind of against a strip of the Red Sea that actually goes into the Indian Ocean and also kind of links to the Nile and links up to the Jordan Valley. We kind of, like Herodotus described very clearly that the Phoenicians were circumnavigating Africa, and through the details he offers about where the sun was for these kind of sailors, you can clearly see it's the case. These people had kind of one of their power bases was that was linked to Axum. They would have had this coast of Africa. They said that their gold resources were from the west coast of Africa, largely because Nubia was hidden behind a veil of secrecy, because much myth making in kind of, you know, in the biblical text and in Greek mythology, it's about protection of these valuable resources, you know. So they also, we've got the Mediterranean, we've got the ability to circumnavigate Africa. They also had maritime routes in the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea up on the steppe. And then in addition to this is a civilization who have emerged using waterways. We talked about the city of Mari and the cities that emerged on the banks of the Euphrates, and the fact that the Nile triggers development of the agricultural economy in Egypt. The rivers are a natural way for these people to kind of get around. The Phoenicians were famed for having multiple types of boat, and the way that they built their boats was incredibly simple. It was almost flat pack, because they could alter their boat technology according to the waterway. In addition, they had routes up. UK, Britannia, was a tin source for the Phoenicians. Our Neolithic development is triggered by Syrian seeds. Our early religious development, the rise of kind of the changes in burial practice, in god kings, the emergence of our early elites, kind of our Bronze Age elites, is linked to this trade. This is a very sophisticated civilization who are doing this all over Europe. They, you know, and in Africa, and, you know, their interaction is actually catalyzing other civilizations. Now, when we discuss in particular modern day Turkey, we were talking about the kind of route from through the Cilician Gate as a route off the steppe. We have been discussing the steppe throughout these videos. This is the strip of land where, if you look on a world map from China to kind of Europe, you'll see it's broken into the eastern and the western steppe. And the two main gates to get up and off the steppe are the Zungarian Gate in China, which is a railway corridor, and the Cilician Gate in Turkey. Now, we know that this kind of territory is incredibly important. We know that multiple, and I mean like, just, I can't even tell you how many different groups of nomadic people at the roots of civilizations elsewhere originate on the steppe. To understand what we describe as Celtic, and this is a bad word to use, civilization, you have to understand their roots in people from the steppe. The roots of Scandinavian civilization is people from the steppe. But these are people who did not leave records. The descriptions of them in civilizations who are describing them, they're often not complementary, they're otherized, or, you know, they're treated as barbarians, but the evidence suggests this is not the case. But we are left with having to put together different ways to track the influence of these people. But these people are central to this political engine at Kadesh and to the maritime networks that the Phoenicians were part of. There are many ways that you can track people from the steppe. You can track their technology, things like the composite bow, which was a bow which used sinew, which kind of changed technology. The chariot comes from the steppe. The wheel comes from the steppe. In religious artifacts, we talked about bronze works in China, which were very, very early and very, very stunning. But the cast bronze works that you see from China in the Neolithic period, for the rest of us, like their Bronze Age, you actually see repeated in wine cauldrons at the center of civilizations across Europe in the 1st century. When Christopher Beckwith is discussing the Eurasian culture complex, he's talking about civilizations that have roots in people from the steppe, but he's talking about people all over Europe. He's talking about Germany. When you look at the Celtic civilization, I hate the word Celtic, it doesn't work, but it's the word that we have. In Germany, you're talking about Hallstatt culture. In Heuneberg, you're talking about highly developed kind of settlements where they're using mud brick technology and building techniques that are seen in other peoples from the steppe. When you're looking at the Glauberg warrior, which I'll put a picture of underneath, you're seeing an aesthetics which actually you can find at Petra in Jordan, because it's all these influences. There is a description in the Christopher Beckwith book about an altercation between Darius the Mede, who's a Persian leader who we're going to discuss next week, and the Scythians. And the Scythians remind Darius of where their ancestors are buried, and he backs off. This is because they are referencing Petra, ancestor worship, as at the center of this city. It was presumed to be a city of the dead. This is because nomadic people are kind of organizing here. You can track the influence of kind of peoples from the steppe through belief systems that emerge. You see throughout Europe the triple aspect goddess, the sacred grove, is at the center of governance. Vercingetorix in kind of 1st century, kind of what we would call modern day France. Vercingetorix consults with his tribal federation at the sacred grove. This is at the center of governance across Europe. We are used to seeing the history of Europe through Roman eyes, but in actual fact, Rome appears very, 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 very late in this picture. Now, in the last kind of videos, we talked about the impact of the stories of Solomon as a change in governance, and a very, very important story that changes the way that civilization develops. And this is very, very true. Now, in the period, kind of as the Phoenicians' kind of maritime networks mature, their hold on the Mediterranean from the European side is not necessarily coming from the mainland. It's islands like Sicily, Sardinia, Crete, Cyprus. These are the islands which hold the Mediterranean. And we're talking about Greece, like mainland Greece since the Mycenaeans, have been in kind of isolation within this, and they go into a dark ages. And Rome are not even real, like, in fact, the origin myth of the guy at the core of Roman civilization, the origin myth about Romulus and Remus, is a guy called Aeneas, Aeneas. And this is an origin myth which is rooted in these events that are recorded in Exodus or in the Battle of Troy and Greek mythology. And in fact, origin myths are a very good way to track where people from the steppe have been. The story of Moses, the baby in the basket rescued by the flood, is a highly symbolic story. We see it with Sargon of Akkad. We see the same motifs, that Christopher Beckwith is again excellent on this, replicated through the Turks, through the Mongols, through the Chu Chinese, because this land that we call the steppe is the origins of all these people. And this is why we have to use kind of mythology and texts like Genesis much more cleverly to understand what they're telling us about these early systems. Now, in terms of actual roads, like there are actually some really, like the road systems that these people had that were linked to Petra are incredibly important and ancient. There is a highway called the King's Highway that tourists still use to get to Petra today. This King's Highway is referenced in Genesis 14 and Numbers 20 because this is actually a road that goes all the way from Petra down to Heliopolis in Egypt. It's actually the road that later on in Islamic tradition becomes the route of the Hajj. When Cyrus the Great emerges after kind of the story, the stories of the Jewish exile in response to the Babylonian and Assyrian threat, not only is Cyrus the Great the first time you can see the territories bound at the political engine at Petra, but he also rebuilds the royal road, the road from Susa, and it's said to go to the Aegean, but this is because myth making has to hide where these roads go. It's actually Alexander the Great getting access to this road that actually possibly, along with his access to the Cilician Gate, leads to him being able to get these territories so quickly. Now, the word royal road and King's Highway is incredibly important. Petra was not a site that was open to everybody all the time. It was a centre of diplomacy for royalty. I'm interested in it because of the systems that are represented by the stories of Hagar and Ishmael, the stories of, welfare systems being embedded, the stories of the children of Moab represents a welfare function that's contained here alongside the harem function. The harem function at the core of the Harabu women is also at the roots of an educational network that becomes incredibly important, called the Essenes, who we associate with kind of events in the 1st century and kind of Christianity. But if you look in the Josephus histories, you find that this has roots in ancient Egypt in the period that we call the Exodus. A harem system is one where princes and highly kind of privileged young people are educated. But what became established here and continues is this is in conjunction with this system described by the children of Moab. Highly educated and very intelligent orphans would be educated alongside these highly privileged young people. Now, the Essenes network itself was, if you look in the Book of Numbers, there's a Nazarite vow, which became a very popular thing for royalty to do to express their kind of religious devotion. And this would be a way of promising your firstborn into this system. This was a very prestigious thing to do. But this creates a system where not only is it networking across all these different royal houses, and you can find references to this brotherhood in Roman literature and Greek literature. This is a networking system for highly privileged young people between kings, but it's also the roots of education systems, which are replicated and is at the roots of the shape of the educational system in the Islamic Empire. You see this continuation of highly educated orphans being educated alongside royalty. This is actually very likely to be very relevant to the stories of Muhammad. It's also relevant, this network is relevant and linked to the authority of the Bible. You see references, Muhammad's night journeys are this is a pattern that's repeated. This is a system of learning that's about parables, stories that stick in the mind, so that this history can actually be communicated. This is at the core of scribal schools. This is the center of issuing literature and law for these civilizations. And while in the modern world our interest in it is about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this is actually the roots of welfare and education systems that form the intellectual basis of world education systems. Now, in the modern world, we understand, I have to understand World War II to understand the post-war settlement and the institutions of the welfare state. We kind of are beginning to understand that welfare systems are at the center of political economy, and I certainly understand that actually studying welfare is always studying wars. This is very important in understanding the journey that Petra takes. The story of Solomon, which we outlined, where the covenant is lost here, is very, very important for kind of, if you like, the history of Petra is associated with questions over child sacrifice and sacrificial practices and harm to women and children. Because what we understand in the modern world is that systems that are, you know, if you have very vulnerable children and women alongside very powerful kind of trading oasis and political center, there are going to be predictable consequences. The actual covenant that's broken with Solomon, if you read like the first paragraph of Song of Songs, it's Ishkeni mi neshko piu ki tobim dodeka miayin. And it's basically, it says, regardless of what he says with his mouth, your love is sweeter than wine. And it's talking about the relationships that are shaped and managed by these high priestesses and bound by this covenant. These political relationships and connections and this deep history that we share is more important than what Solomon says. And then it's Laria, which means fragrance, and it's about we are communicating to you, this will be understood. Shamanika Tobim Shimen Turak, and in the Bible this is kind of translated as your ointments come forth. It actually means seed. The word is semen. Shamanika Alken Alamo Ahabuka. It's your name will be on kind of this story. Your name will be on the consequences of this because of the virgins who loved you. It's about the harm to women, as what Solomon's breach of covenant introduces back to this city is what Abraham and Sarah's covenant was a move away from. They introduced the Kaaba as a move away from sacred marriage. Solomon kind of he represents a reintroduction of sacred marriage, of, you know, his stable of 300 women, his lucrative vineyard. But the high place of sacrifice is actually said to be built by Solomon on Petra. This is the beginning of a very disturbing history about harm to women and children in a city that was supposed to be about their protection. This is at the core of the holy covenant that's lost. This is where my interest in it came. But the converse of it is that the real world, like the external kind of impact of what Solomon has done, this breaching of this covenant, is not only that Meroe becomes a political governance center as well as an economic center, but it means fundamental changes in other civilizations. We're talking about a period of instability between about 800 BC and 600 BC, I think, which includes the rise of the Assyrians. It includes kind of Jerusalem being kind of taken over. It also includes the introduction of Greek civilization to this engine in some way. This is kind of represented in stories of Jason and the Argonauts with King Salmoneus, about him kind of, you know, about Greeks being able to expand into this territory. When Josephus writes about Solomon, he talks about Solomon trying to strike deals with cities in Tyre and other places to make up for this loss of covenant. But the converse of this is this actually allows a Greek civilization who have been excluded from this system of organization kind of access to it. And all of a sudden, it's very useful to use Greek mythology to kind of overlay, to try to understand the political machinations. The book of Zechariah, prophecy in the Bible, is amazing for this. It's either talking about political instability or the internal welfare systems. Isaiah is particularly good on the treatment of the children of Moab and the need to address this. But Zechariah is really good on the political instability that is generated here. The fury in Zechariah at the city of Tyre for their like opening this up. But the converse is that Greek civilization is catalyzed here. This is stories that you have to understand that this one situation that this man has been at the root of at this city at Petra, this causes real-world political changes that stretch far and wide. It's around kind of 841 BC that the city of Carthage, which had been established near modern-day Tunis, it starts to become the center of what we previously associated with the Phoenicians. We commonly look at the Carthaginians as emerging from the Phoenicians. This is the event that moves that governance to there. And all of a sudden, the Carthaginian Empire is kind of literally an entity that we understand. And then to understand the world at this point, you have to understand the Carthaginians and the Persians. But you also have to understand the way Europe is emerging from this. Sicily and Sardinia are very much at the center of maintaining this. You know, Rome is emerging as a city, and it's actually kind of looking at islands that it sees as its own, kind of at the roots of this empire. In actual fact, the power here is in North Africa. Now, European civilization at this point is becoming highly developed. We have the civilizations that we associate with the Celts. The first action that Rome does in their kind of ascent is they have to build the Sevilla Wall because of attacks from the Celts. But because of our reliance on Roman and Greek sources, and they are largely emerging from this context, they are intimidated by their identity is made fragile by revealing this. They're not sharing that this is the foundation of their empires. They want you to believe that they just did this out of nowhere. But this is a highly developed political and economic context, which mythology and biblical text can give us insight into, as long as we don't drink the wine and we actually don't take them literally, and we actually treat them as symbolic representations and transmissions of history shaped by the identity of those at the core of this text. By the time you get to the emergence of Greek, you know, the Carthaginian Empire dominate kind of even Europe till 146 BC. This is a 1,000-year journey from the Bronze Age collapse to the emergence of Roman dominance. It's a 1,000-year journey. This is the systems that emerge, and these are the systems that emerge when Rome changes course. We are just beginning in the modern world to realize, well, in the Western world, that we have to look past Roman sources and Greek sources and put them in this context. Now, when I come back next week, I'm going to do 2 videos, one on Persia and one on Greece, but these are very intertwined civilizations. They are talking about the same territories, they are dynastically entwined, and you have to look at their sources together. When you read Herodotus on the kind of wars that formed the Greek civilization as we know it, you can see very clearly, sometimes I think Herodotus was writing from Petra, I really do. So I will be back next week to look at the next stages in Greek civilization, what we call the Greek classical age, and also to look at the rise of the Persians. I'm going to be back at some point, possibly I don't know, with a book review on Capital at the 21st century, because I put up that video about the G7 instead of putting that up. So I'm going to put that up at some point. Thank you very much.